Welcome to another edition of Whole Hog Politics. I'm Bill Sammon of the Hill and NewsNation, and I'm joined by Chris Stirewalt, who wears many hats, including political editor of the Hill, host of the Hill Sunday on NewsNation, and author of Whole Hog Politics, the premier political newsletter that's published every Friday morning on thehill.com. Chris, I wasn't going to start with this, but the tweet that the White House sent out over the week overnight. I think the headline was what was it? These things we are not the same, and it was a picture. It was two pictures next to each other. One was Trump meeting with the mother of a Baltimore woman who was killed by an illegal immigrant. The other was Senator Chris Van Hollen, Maryland Democrat, meeting with Abrego Garcia down in El Salvador, who was allegedly a gang member, certainly an illegal immigrant to the United States. Tell me about the messaging. We could talk all day about the legal and constitutional aspects of this case, but from a raw political standpoint, is Trump winning the political messaging war with this? Because it reminds me a little bit of that ad, Trump is for you, Kamala's for they, them.
Well, it depends on what you mean by winning. If the goal is to keep the Donald Trump, the secret to Donald Trump's political success is that he's never been popular, but he has been intensely popular among a relatively small number of intense, loyal followers. So if you can keep your third of the electorate together, you can swing it like a wrecking ball into everything else, because the other two-thirds of the electorate is divided between traditional conservatives, moderates, progressives, and liberals. So if you can keep MAGA intact, it is a cudgel that you can just beat the snot out of all your political opponents with. And the messaging that you see in that post and that you hear from JD Vance and others is you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. If you're not with us, if you're complaining about due process, then you're siding with murderers. And it puts Trump's many critics on the right, people like Andy McCarthy and Ed Whelan and other serious, sober-sided conservative critics of what the administration's doing, puts them in a difficult spot because I think we would say they are heightening the contrast and making it difficult for their critics on the right to complain.
Yeah, because now what Trump does is, the playing field is now the topic of immigration. And, as oversimplified as he might make it, every time we're talking about immigration, we're not talking about tariffs and the economy. And, I think that's sort of the way Trump wants this, right? Because immigration, despite the way Trump has implemented his policies on against illegal immigration, which have been a little chaotic, is basically a popular issue, not just with MAGA, but with the country. The country generally believes illegal immigration should be reduced. People should follow the law when they enter the country. So he's on safer political terrain in general talking about this topic than he is about tariffs, which are doing all kinds of crazy things to the economy. They're reducing people's 401ks. So isn't that what this is really about? What we're talking about?
I point to the Afghanistan example for Joe Biden. It was a 75-25 issue. Americans wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan. Trump wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan. Biden wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan. And then he did it. And then people didn't like the way he did it. And they didn't like how it turned out. Execution ultimately matters. When you look at what's happening for Donald Trump's support among Hispanic voters, when you look at anxiety and ferment in the electorate about how they're doing what they're doing, the problem for the administration is that they succeeded in meeting the public expectation on immigration almost immediately, right? They sealed the border. They started ratcheting up deportations of criminals. and that puts America said, yes, that's what we wanted. And you saw, even as Trump's job approval on economic issues starts to really decline, he stays solid, very solid on the question of immigration. Now we're in the when the president says, I want to deport citizens, if I'm Marco Rubio or I'm anybody in that administration and I'm sitting in the room, I'm like, fella, this is not, you're not helping the message. The message is we're going to be very tough on illegal immigrants. We're going to be very tough on criminals. We're going to be super tough. But Trump can't, whatever you tell Donald Trump that he can't have is the thing that he must have. If you tell him he can't have Greenland, he can think only of Greenland. If you tell him, actually, and it was interesting to watch the argumentation from the administration. Well, these people are not citizens, so who cares? Why are you complaining? Why, Chris Holland, do you care more about illegal immigrants than the victims of crimes? That's a pretty good political argument. And they say it. It's not like these people are citizens or we're trying to deport citizens. And Trump goes, "Hold on, guys. Let's workshop that. Let's talk about deporting citizens." And the always more. There's always more. There's always the next ratchet up. I have to keep reminding myself, and it was you who pointed it out to me when we were talking about the 90-day extension on tariffs, or the delay on tariffs. He hadn't even been in office 90 days. It's still very early going, and the amount of leeway that people outside of that base, that third of the electorate, the amount of leeway that people have for wild and woolly is, as Joe Biden learned the hard way and Democrats learned the hard way, there's a low appetite for wild and woolly in the next persuadable third of the electorate.
My last question on this, you said you acknowledge that maybe it's good politics. To what extent are Democrats giving Trump an assist by making those pilgrimages down to El Salvador, by constantly talking about this issue? Because this is an issue that has really got Democrats very riled up. And, merits, set aside the merits, because I think there are some very good reasons to get riled up about this. But from, again, a raw political perspective, are Democrats helping Trump by keeping it as the main issue?
The Chris Van Hollen, for his own political interests, he represents Maryland. I'm sure that this question in Maryland is overwhelming, right? I'm sure Trump is at 25% or whatever support in Maryland on this question. So Van Hollen is doing what is in his narrow self-interest. But the challenge that Democrats face, and also, frankly, traditional conservative Republicans face, when they say, if you fight back, you're only helping him, they watch Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and they watch these progressives, the hardcore Democratic Socialist left. They're not waiting, right? And so it creates this impulse, this urge in normie Democrats, and even among, I read David Brooks in the New York Times today, and he's calling for a national uprising. So people are freaked out, they're anxious, and they want to spook and run in the direction of the resistance. But then they think, oh, if we resist, are we really just helping Trump? So he's got him over a barrel. They're in sixes and sevens.
You brought up AOC. She has been drawing very large and enthusiastic crowds with her tour of various places across the country with Bernie Sanders. 10,000, 20,000, sometimes 30,000 people. I saw clips of people chanting AOC, AOC. And I couldn't help but think that this is a woman that's probably well positioned to run for president in 2028. And in fact, may be looking to lock up the liberal lane of the Democratic primary process. I don't see a lot of people chanting Ro Khanna, although, it's still early. My question, Chris, is she locking up the liberal lane? And this is a very separate question, for now, do the Republicans want AOC to be the face of the Democratic Party?
Well, if I was a Republican, I wouldn't be too worried about who I'm going to face in 2028, because there's what condition Donald Trump's approval rating is. How is Donald Trump impeached a third time? There is so much that is going to transpire between now and then. And the Republicans could hope that they could turn the midterms into a choice election and a referendum on AOC Democrats instead of the party in power. And that's not a bad in terms of what are you going to do? This is sort of like they used to do Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So
Stephen Miller was on Fox last night saying, something about, well, the Democrats, I guess they're led by AOC now. So I think that's starting to click, and I think that's going to be the way they go.
So for Ocasio-Cortez, the progressive, she's not a liberal, right? She's a progressive. She's not a liberal in the sense of the gifts of the Enlightenment kind of liberal. She and David Brooks aren't hanging out. She's a progressive, and she is a progressive in the same way that MAGA is nationalist, right? So you have these two groups on either end that look at the Constitution and go, it had its day, but it's time for bold structural change.
All right. Well, I want to continue down on these definitions, Chris, because I've been meaning to ask you about this. Okay, you make the argument that the two main parties in America today are sort of dominated at the moment by populists. Now, it's easy for me to see what you're talking about when you look at the Republican Party, because it's easy to see how MAGA, Trump, populist Republicans are different from the George W. Bush Republicans, the Mitt Romney Republicans that we all have known for many decades, in that, those traditional Republicans were free traders. They were often interventionalists. They were strong on NATO. They did not, they were constitutionalists. They did not go around talking about raising taxes on the rich, which I actually heard out of a Republican's mouth this week in the form of.
They're getting there. They're working their way up to it.
So I understand that distinction on the right between the populist wing of I guess you'd have to say of the Republican Party and the traditional normie Republicans, but it's a little fuzzier for me on the left. I understand you say that, Ocasio-Cortez and I guess Bernie Sanders and maybe Elizabeth Warren are populists and therefore not sort of normie traditional Democrats. But tell me from a policy perspective what the differences are in that distinction.
I think you have to start with a philosophical distinction. And the philosophical distinction, to quote our colleague George Will, we would say that traditional American conservatism, the kind that you're talking about, is conserving a revolution, right? It's conserving the American Revolution and the fruits of that revolution. And what those things were basically the gifts of the Enlightenment about individual rights and the American creed. What we say in the preamble about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where do our rights come from? What is the government's job?
Is this like Edmund Burke kind of?
You got Burkeans, absolutely. Okay. So on the left side of that, so if you picture your continuum going across, you have George Will and those conservatives right here. Right on the other side of the ticker, you have traditional liberal Democrats who like the fruits of the Enlightenment, but they don't need it in the narrow packaging of the American Revolution and the founding. They're into generally individual rights. It's a very European, it's a more European version of the American conservatism. When you go out to the nationalists on the right and you go to the progressives on the left, the progressives that we're talking about today are the children of Woodrow Wilson, and they're the children of Teddy Roosevelt. And these are the people who have been saying since the turn of the previous century, the American constitutional order is not sufficient to meet the requirements of a modern age. And what we need is more direct democracy, more of the will of the people. And you see on both sides, they emphasize big crowds, they emphasize popular will, they emphasize the sentiment, and look at institutions, constitutional institutions, as impediments. So if you take AOC, who calls herself, or used to call herself anyway, a democratic socialist, and Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, not so much, but still in the same place. If you take those folks and you compare it to Josh Shapiro, let's say, on specific policy points, tariffs or whatever else, we could find the differences, but it's a difference in approach. You have one side of this that says we got to keep it in the basic framework of a constitutional or Enlightenment era way of being. And then you have people to their left who say, you don't know what time it is, sucker. It's too late for that. And the oligarchs already control us, and everything is already ruined, and we live in a failed state. So it's time to get radical. And so it's a question of, are we trying to preserve something, or are we trying to clear away the debris of history and begin anew?
So that's a good philosophical explanation of the difference. But I'm going to press you on to give me at least one example of a policy difference, because on the right, I can point to trade, I can point to NATO, I can point to a lot of things. But
well, how about trade? How about trade? Jared Paulus and Shapiro and other Democrats have responded to Donald Trump's trade war by saying tariffs hurt, and they should only be used as a tool to get to more fair trade. Basically, they're saying what Elon Musk and Scott Bessent are saying, which is tariffs are a tool. They always cause pain, and you should use them to inflict pain, but as little as possible, because it causes pain for yourself too. And then over here, you listen to people who are sort of economic planners, and these are the people who say, actually, we need a full regime of tariffs in order to try to create the jobs and economy that we want here in the United States. So I think that's a very clear policy divide. How about Israel? How about the question of how do we interact with the conflict between Israel and Hamas? Is this settler colonialism in which the Jewish state is engaged in ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians and oppressed people, or is this Israel has a right to defend itself? We don't necessarily like the way that Benjamin Netanyahu does it. So there's lots of places where they diverge.
Now, the last question on this, you seem to argue, Chris, and correct me if I'm wrong, that because the two parties are dominated by these populist wings, respectively, that leaves the normies, both Democrats and Republicans, without enough critical mass to win elections with the types of traditional candidates they like to see win. But you seem to suggest that if it weren't for a couple different minor things, those two groups could somehow get together as a bloc. And is that realistic, or
I think
am I oversimplifying your argument?
I think we live in a 20-20-60 country. I think there's 20% of real hard left, and there's 20% of real hard right, and then there's 60% that live on a continuum here from. And we have talked before, and I talk all the time about the governing third, that middle of the political spectrum that it ranges from almost always Democratic, but sometimes Republican. Those are folks who, if we're talking about Maryland, people who voted for Chris Van Hollen, but also were very happy to twice vote for Larry Hogan for the governor of Maryland.
Republican.
And then you could go to the other side of the people who usually vote Republican, but occasionally we can think about the folks in Alabama who wouldn't vote for Roy Moore, who voted for Donald Trump, and happily would have voted for Luther Strange, but weren't going to vote for Roy Moore. So you go from those edges into the real persuadables right there in the middle, who have low political low ideological attachment and low partisan affiliation. Those are lower propensity voters. And one of the things that the Biden administration forgot, and the Trump administration is aggressively forgetting, those people are lightly attached, right? On the day after the 2024 election, those persuadable voters who blooped over and moved over 10 points, 8 or 10 points from 2020 to 2024, did not say, and now I pledge my soul and my existence to the Republican Party. No, they said, enough of that. Let's let the other guy do it. And they will just as easily slide back over the other
Yeah.
way because they're not invested in the success of either party. That's what makes them persuadable voters.
Chris, I would be remiss if we got through this episode of Whole Hog Politics and didn't mention David Hogg. David
Oh boy.
Hogg, the newly elected vice chairman of the Democratic National Committee, which traditionally a Democratic National Committee has done everything in its power to keep incumbent Democrats in office.
It's their
But
job.
David Hogg has just announced that he's also with another group. I think it's called Leaders We Deserve. And he's going to spend $20 million unseating incumbent Democrats. Um, Presumably, he's 25 years old. He wants younger Democrats, more with it Democrats, and he wants to get rid of people like exemplified by the likes of Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, Al Green, the cane waving Texas Democrat who interrupted the president's State of the Union speech. Um, my question is this, Chris. Would the purging of the Democratic Party of many of its moderates make it more or less likely for Democrats to retake control of the House next year?
The well, obviously, it would be worse. But think about it maybe this way. You were a different person when you came out of St. Ignatius High in Cleveland, Ohio, than you were when you went in, and you were a different person when you came out of Miami of Ohio, than when you went in, and you're a different man now than you were on the day you got married. The institutions that you have been in your life have made you a different person. They've been formative of you, and that's what we like, right? We like it when institutions form people into good outcomes. What David Hogg represents is the same thing on the left that we've seen on the right. The left is catching up to the right, which is, I will not be formed by being an officer of the Democratic National Committee. I don't care. I'm not interested in the history of the Democratic National Committee. I'm not interested in what the party was like. I'm not
I'm not going to
interested.
wait my turn and earn pay my
Don't you
dues
and
and move up the
don't
ladder.
you yeah, don't you tell me about Harold Ickes, and I don't want to hear about it. Don't you tell me about it, because you don't know what time it is. You don't know what time it is, chump. And I am here to tell you that I, basically a child, know better than you. And I'm going to kick your institution over, and I'm going to stand on top of it. And this is something that my boss at AEI talks about. Yuval Levin. Formative versus performative institutions. Is it an institution that you will be formed by and it will shape your character? Or is it something that you're going to stand on top of and say, look at me? And the Democrats are making the same mistakes that I say they're mistakes in the sense that imagining somehow they're avoidable. They're not avoidable, probably. But remember when Republicans were like, hey, Marjorie Taylor Greene, let's get you in the leadership. What if we put you in the leadership?
What could go
Hey,
wrong?
let's get you up here. We're not a typical smoke-filled room. We're a cool smoke-filled room, and we want to get you in here to do it. And it will, for Democrats, it's going to work out about as well as it did for Republicans, which is to say that if the Democrats stay on the trend, the place where we end up as a country is the 20% in each side control the parties, and then you just go back and forth, radical to radical, until the 60% in the middle finds a way to stop it.
You just to go back, you mentioned, well, I'll go back to AOC for a second because you talk about, I'm struck by the fact that at these rallies that she's held, it's almost as if we're witnessing the conscious passing of a baton from the older Bernie Sanders,
For
who's
sure.
83 years old, who,
My daughter.
he joked about this is my daughter, although she's young enough to be actually his granddaughter. She's 35. And he's even indicated that he's really not going to be running for president again. And there's a lot of talk about her running for president. And I couldn't help but think about the passing of a baton way before the next presidential election. In other words, there's plenty of time to get this out of the way, but it's so different than the way another elderly Democrat handled this kind of a situation. Joe Biden didn't pass the baton until it was far too late when he passed it to Kamala Harris. And I think this time around, maybe there's a lesson to be learned there with Bernie getting that out of the way early.
As book after book, as the mea culpas of Democrats and the press continue to roll out about Joe Biden, you're just struck by what a tragic, sad story of Joe Biden and how he ruined things for his party. What he told Kamala Harris, the demands he made of Kamala Harris, no daylight, and the pressure on her to defend the indefensible in his what was indefensible in his administration. He demanded that she defend it. Whereas, of course, if you would have had an opportunity for Kamala Harris, Joe Biden had no constituency, right? There was no constituency. In 1968, when Hubert Humphrey split basically with LBJ on the Vietnam War, there were Southern Democrats. There were conservative Democrats. There were folks who were mad at Hubert Humphrey inside the Democratic Party. It had consequences for his base when there was rupture between LBJ and Hubert Humphrey. And LBJ, actually, we now know, was secretly kind of helping Nixon win because he liked Nixon on Vietnam better than he liked Humphrey. There are no Biden Democrats. Zero. There is no Democrat in America who is like, what kind of Democrat are you? I'm a Joe Biden Democrat. And if Kamala Harris had been able to say, Joe, I love you. And what would Joe Biden say? He'd say, God bless you. God bless you, you'd say. But for me, it's going to be like this. And she couldn't do it because, not just because they made a deal, but also because Joe Biden would have gone out and made a story out of it, right? He would have gone out and complained about it and pounded the lectern. The fact that Joe Biden ended his presidency with selfishness, with corruption, I'm pardoning my son, I'm doing all this stuff. When you look at the transit from Election Day 2020 to his departure in 2025, it is one of the true tragic stories in American public life.
It really is, and it's summed up quite well in the book Fight, which is written by one of our reporters at the Hill, Amy Parnes,
Getting big. Many people are saying it's the best Biden book yet.
It's the #1 New York Times bestseller. I've been involved, and you have too, with books here and there, and this thing is a runaway train. It's in its fourth printing, 100,000 copies. I could not be happier for Amy and Jonathan. Chris, let's end on a trivia question, and I'm going to give you an easy one, presidential trivia, but my follow-up might be a little harder. And the question is this: what two states represent a third? There are two states in which a third of our presidents were born.
Okay,
What
Virginia
are those
and Ohio. Virginia and Ohio.
It was way too easy. So I'm going to let you try to name the presidents from Virginia.
Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, William Henry Harrison.
Yes.
John Tyler.
Yes. I'm
gonna go with. I think I'm hitting the wall.
Okay.
I'm at 5, and I know I'm not done. But
Woodrow
who
Wilson.
did I forget?
Woodrow Wilson.
That guy.
Zachary Taylor. And
yes.
Did you say James Monroe?
Yeah.
Did you say Madison?
Yep. Oh, I didn't say Madison. How could I forget Madison?
Yeah. Okay.
My favorite founding father, and I'm talking to you from 15 miles away from his crib.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to ask you to name the presidents from my home state of Ohio, many of which did not
wait
their terms.
Wait, Grant, the other Harrison.
You're going there.
I want it. Grant, the
Harrison.
Other Harrison. Hayes, McKinley, Harding,
Wow.
um,
5 out of 7.
uh, bu- 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 Taft,
6 out of 7.
uh, and who am I missing? There's some obvious person, and I'm not getting it. And I'm sorry. Okay, I stop at
Did
6.
you
What do you
say
got?
Garfield?
Oh, and I forgot my favorite on that one
James,
too. My favorite,
James,
the
James
greatest
Garfield.
missed story, the greatest missed story. I cannot recommend highly enough Candace Millard's book about Garfield and his assassination and the moment that James A. Garfield just blocks from where you are now on the place where the Federal Trade, near where the Federal Trade Commission is now, where he was shot, and the missed moment for the country, and the amazing story of Chester Arthur going from spoils system dirtbag to civil service reformer and how it all happened. Cannot recommend the book highly enough. Great book, great read, great president. A missed opportunity.
That sounds awesome. That's all the time we have for this week's edition of Whole Hog Politics. I'm Bill Sammon from the Hill and NewsNation, saying goodbye to Chris Stirewalt, who is the political editor of the Hill. He's the host of the Hill Sunday on NewsNation and the author of Whole Hog Politics.